Hi folks, in this video I am trying to give you a little more practical guidance before you jump into the Value Champion simulation this week. In the last video we talked about sustainable competitive advantage. Remember, you might recall, competitive advantage, we're talking about driving a wedge between customer willingness to pay and the cost it takes to produce a good or service. I gave you two tools to think about that, or two approaches. One was the resource-based view. You use the VRIO framework to evaluate resources and how they relate to competitive advantage. The other tool is the value chain, which instead of looking at resources, looks at a firm's activities. If you're going to analyze a firm's activities, you start by using that template. You break down a firm's activities into, and we'll give you this blank template again, you've seen this before hopefully, into these different buckets. Then you analyze each key activity and its drivers to look for ways to either reduce the firm's cost or increase the buyer's willingness to pay. Finally, you have to decide on an overall customer value proposition and kind of mix and match and pick which activities best and most efficiently deliver on that promise. So for the simulation that you are assigned this week, you are looking at a manufacturing firm. So let's talk about some of the typical activities in a manufacturing firm, because some of you may be familiar with manufacturing, some of you may not be. So I took it upon myself to give you some guidance on what those typical activities might look like for a manufacturer. This might not perfectly align with the simulation, so you'll need to use a little bit of your own judgment here too. But you can look at in support activities, for example, under the human resource management bucket, you see hire, train, and reward employees, assign employees to positions in the firm. That's not unique to manufacturers. But if you look under primary activities, inbound logistics, receive and store raw materials, operations, transform raw materials into quality finished products, that is unique to a manufacturer. So take a moment to familiarize yourself with some of these activities. You can deviate from this. This is not prescriptive, but this might provide you a little guidance as you start thinking about the activities that the firm that you're going to be running for the simulation might engage in. The next step I mentioned is to break down those activities into their drivers. Drivers are factors that impact a key activity's cost or the buyer's willingness to pay. So let me give you an example. Let me give you some examples of drivers. Learning, scale, capacity utilization, linkages, integration, policy choices, interrelationships, timing, location, and institutional factors. Oof, it's a long laundry list. But think about these things. Economies of scale is a concept you are probably familiar with and comfortable with. But instead of looking at it a firm level, think about each step in the value chain, each activity, and whether there are economies of scale at that step. Note that not all of these drivers are going to be relevant for each activity or possibly any of the activities you encounter in the simulation. Some of the drivers that are most common in manufacturing firms are learning, scale, capacity utilization, linkages, integration, and policy choices. So learning is the idea of how long has the key activity been performed. You gain efficiency the longer a firm has engaged in an activity. Capacity utilization asks how much of the firm's capacity is being used in that stage of activity. Can you increase the capacity utilization for that activity? Linkages asks you to examine the alignment between activities in the firm. Is there good coordination amongst them? Integration asks you to understand if that activity is done in-house or outsourced, and are there advantages to outsourcing or keeping that activity in-house. policy choices are things like choosing your customer, what kind of promotions are you using, assembly for products, things of those natures. So you now have a list of drivers to investigate, and hopefully this will give you a starting point in the simulation as you try to break down the key activities of this manufacturing firm and make better choices.